Well, in other breaking news this afternoon, the release of a report by the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, which reveals extensive failures by local authorities and police forces, and finds that the sexual exploitation of children by groups of abusers happens more than official statistics say. The report, which is the inquiry's 18th, focuses on abuse by organizing networks. It looks at 6 case study areas that have not been the subject of well-publicised investigations into that issue: St Helens, Tower Hamlets, Swansea, Durham, Bristol and Warwickshire, and the experiences of 33 children from those areas. The report finds it is clear that the sexual exploitation of children by groups of associated abusers continues to be widespread and happens to a greater extent than official statistics indicate. It says extensive failures by local authorities and police forces meant they failed to keep pace with the changing nature of this crime. It also found that children were being sexually exploited by networks in all parts of England and Wales in, quote, the most degrading and destructive ways. It said that there is a flawed assumption that child sexual exploitation is decreasing, when in reality, it has just become more of a hidden problem, as well as a reluctance from some local authorities to be labelled the next Rotherham or Rochdale, meaning they did not give authorities the necessary data on the problem in their area. This guy's Ali Fortescue joins me now. Ali, the 18th report, and damning, absolutely damning.
Once again, an absolutely damning report. As you say, this is it. It has just come out in the last few moments, almost 200 pages long, and it makes incredibly uncomfortable reading. You were saying there some of the most difficult quotes. It says that in all parts of the country, children being sexually exploited by networks in the most degrading way. It said that there have been extensive failures, and I quote, from local authorities and police who've struggled to keep pace with change. Now, look, at a number of different local authority areas, including Durham, including Bristol, Swansea in Wales, and spoke to more than 30 different children, as well as people who had survived abuse between 2003 and 2011. It's hard to bring you all of their stories, but I will bring you one of them, a story of a 12-year-old girl who was first abused at the age of 12. Her perpetrator was imprisoned, but just 2 years later, she was abused by 20 men. And then a few months after that, the charges were dropped. They were charged, but they were never prosecuted. A few months later, she was abducted by another group of men and abused again. So this report highlights the patterns of abuse that were happening. It says that too often people who were victims were being treated like they themselves were offenders, that the perpetrators themselves were not being properly investigated. Now, as you say, this is the latest in this broader inquiry, which has looked at a number of different institutions and individuals, including, for example, Lord Janet's looked at the church, it's looked at councils like Rotherham and Lambeth. This is the 18th report. The final one into residential schools is expected next month, but as you say, more really uncomfortable, damning reading about how some of the most vulnerable children were let down.
Independent inquiry into child sexual abuse reveals extensive failures by local authorities and police forces, and finds that the sexual exploitation of children by groups of abusers happens more than official statistics say. Let's bring in principal lawyer and head of operations for the abuse department at Slater & Gordon, Kim Harrison, and Kim represents one of the victims. Kim, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
You've worked on this report, obviously. What was your reaction when you read it?
It's a very damning report. It's I know from my experience in working with victims and survivors of child sexual exploitation that it's a hidden problem and there's a lot more prevalent than we think it is. I think it's seen as something that we did. So we did that back with Rochdale and Rotherham, and the problem's sort of solved now. And we're now moving on to other problems like child criminal exploitation, which obviously is a really big problem as well. But the report highlights this very, very well and says effectively the way that local authorities and police are gathering data, the way that they're analysing that data means that they're effectively hiding the problem in plain sight. And and merging it with all these other problems. And so nobody really has an idea of how bad it is, other than it has to be worse than the statistics are telling us.
And the report found that they're reluctant to be labelled, as you said, the next Rotherham or Rochdale, so they don't give the necessary data over.
Yes, or just the way that data is counted just doesn't mean that the way that they've set up their systems to count data means that these sorts of things aren't counted. So, for example, in some of the local authority areas that the inquiry examined, child sexual exploitation wouldn't be classed as a separate category. It would be rolled in with other things like child criminal exploitation, which is a really big problem, but is a very different kind of problem, which overlaps with child sexual exploitation, but they both need to be recognised for what they are, and they both potentially have different solutions, and children involved need different sets of support. And so that what's happening is that everybody's collecting their data in a different way, analysing their data in a different way, and sometimes not collecting it very well at all. So the whole thing is just a chaotic mess.
What does it mean when it said that they failed to keep pace with the changing nature of this crime?
So the inquiry report focuses heavily on the fact that so much exploitation of children now occurs through the internet. It referenced a lot, particularly in relation to boys being exploited, things like the dating app Grindr, and things like that as being ways of grooming and sucking children into this exploitation. And effectively that local authorities and police forces are just struggling to keep up with the pace of how the criminals are using technology to change their methods of exploitation.
So then how do you go about unpicking this and dealing with this issue?
I think we need a complete reset on child sexual exploitation in this country. I think that some brilliant work was done in the past, coming out of the horrors of Rochdale and Rotherham. It really felt like there was a few years ago a real renewed energy, both within the government at that time and certain police forces and local authorities to tackle this issue. And I feel that energy has all fizzled away, and we need a complete reset. We need to be completely honest that this problem hasn't gone away. It's not getting less, it's getting worse, that it's everywhere, and that we need to actually have a completely new strategy at a national level to tackle child sexual exploitation, and that has to be fed through into the number of prosecutions. So one of the inquiry recommendations is about sentencing, that it should be an aggravating factor added to the Sentencing Act 2020 if somebody's convicted of offences relating to the sexual exploitation of children. That's brilliant, but we know that so many cases don't even get to be prosecuted, let alone convicted, because we have systemic issues with the resourcing of our criminal justice system. So the police forces investigating these crimes and the CPS deciding to prosecute these crimes just isn't happening at the level that it should be. And so there's no use just altering sentencing if we can't even prosecute people for this atrocious crime in the first place, and that needs to change.
Okay, Kim. Thank you so much for talking to us.